Welcome to the deep dive. You sent us some articles about child abuse and specifically allegations of organized or ritualistic abuse. It seems like you're interested in not just the claims, but the public and media reaction. Okay, well, let's dive right in. One article starts with this really fascinating analogy, the crop circle phenomenon in England. Remember all that back in the 90s? People were convinced it was aliens or some unknown force creating these crazy designs in fields.
Right, and there were all these research centers and publications popping up. It's wild. The Japanese government even funded some of that research. I mean, people were so ready to just accept something totally extraordinary.
It's pretty funny when you think about it, until, of course, those two artists came out and said, psych, it was us the whole time. Can you believe that? Fooling everyone, researchers, the media, even governments, it makes you think, what makes people so quick to believe in the unbelievable?
It really is, and that actually leads perfectly into the heart of this deep dive, organized child abuse. Now, the article specifically mentions this link to satanic rituals, but before we get into specific cases, we need to clarify some of the terminology. We've got ritualistic abuse, satanic ritual abuse, even multidimensional child sex rings. These terms, they're sometimes used interchangeably, but they all actually have distinct meanings and implications. Understanding the nuances is super important here.
Definitely. And speaking of distinct meanings, you sent over a ton of headlines from British newspapers, the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Guardian, some from the early 90s, some more recent, and they all paint a pretty shocking picture. Accusations of sexual abuse, satanic rituals, and lots of scrutiny on how the police and social workers have handled these claims. So what's the common thread you see running through these headlines, especially as it relates to the public and media reaction?
Well, what really jumps at me is the sensationalism. A lot of these headlines, they're designed to grab attention. They use really strong, emotionally charged language. And that can create this whole climate of fear and suspicion, which, as you can imagine, makes it almost impossible for anyone to approach these situations objectively.
So it's almost like the media is adding fuel to the fire instead of actually shedding light on what's going on. And then you have the opposite, where people are so quick to dismiss these allegations as completely false. It's like, I don't know, those crop circles again, folks. We're more willing to believe in aliens than in the possibility of, well, something truly horrific happening right there in their own backyard.
It's a really powerful comparison. This tendency to gravitate towards those extraordinary explanations. It can really blind us to some of the more uncomfortable truths, especially when they challenge our whole understanding of humanity.
Exactly. And that brings us to two specific cases that the articles highlight, Rochdale and Orkney, both incredibly complex and controversial. What can you tell us about Rochdale?
So in Rochdale, a group of children were removed from their homes based on allegations of ritualistic abuse. Seems straightforward, right? But a judge later criticized the social workers involved, questioning their interview techniques and raising concerns about whether those methods actually influenced the children's accounts.
Wow. So it's not just about whether the abuse happened, but also how investigators approach these really, really sensitive situations. What about the Orkney case? I remember that one making headlines for weeks.
Orkney was a complete mess. Imagine a dawn raid, children being removed from their homes amid all these accusations of sexual abuse and satanic rituals. This case led to a huge judicial inquiry, and like you said, it got the media's attention, but for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah. You included an article that really captures that media frenzy. This one's from the Sunday Telegraph, September 1st, 1991. The journalist Anthea Hall writes about the allegations, but with this really dismissive tone. She even uses phrases like wry laughs to describe how the community reacted to the children's claims. It's pretty disturbing.
That kind of reporting is really damaging. It minimizes the seriousness of the allegations and creates this environment where victims, especially children, are terrified to come forward. I mean, who's going to share their story if they think they'll be mocked or disbelieved?
It's heartbreaking, really. It makes you think about the impact on those children, not just from the alleged abuse itself, but also from how their experiences are being portrayed and dismissed by the adults around them.
Exactly. And this is where those psychological concepts you mentioned come into play, like Stockholm Syndrome
Yeah.
and defensive elaboration. It's not about saying all unusual claims are, fabricated, but it's about understanding how trauma can impact a child's perception, their memory, their ability to communicate what happened to them.
So how do we reconcile those two seemingly opposite ideas? The need to be cautious about potentially unreliable accounts, but also making sure we don't automatically dismiss children's claims as just fantasies or lies. It's a tough situation, to say the least.
It is. And that's exactly why approaching these cases with an open mind and a solid understanding of all those psychological complexities is so crucial.
Okay, before we dig deeper into the psychology of trauma and memory, let's just take a second to think about what we've talked about so far. We've got this crop circle analogy highlighting our tendency to look for those outlandish explanations. We've got the media's role in shaping public perception and sometimes even hindering investigations. And then there's this delicate balance between skepticism and empathy when we're dealing with children's accounts of abuse. What stands out to you the most from this initial exploration?
I think what strikes me is the power of belief. Whether it's believing in aliens, making patterns in fields, or believing in the capacity for humans to inflict horrific abuse on children, our beliefs really shape how we see the world around us. The challenge then becomes how to form those beliefs responsibly. How do we consider all perspectives and evidence without giving in to sensationalism or dismissal?
That's a fantastic point. So, for you listening, what resonates with you most from this exploration of child abuse? What aspects are you grappling with? We'll be back after a quick break to dive deeper into the complexities of organized abuse, looking at real-life cases from Australia and unpacking the psychology behind these traumatic experiences. Stay with us.
So before the break, we were talking about how our beliefs can really shape how we see the world, especially when we're dealing with these really difficult topics like child abuse. And, you sent over these Australian news reports, and they really highlight all these different forms of abuse happening in Australia. And the range of these cases, it's quite alarming.
It is. And, we're focusing on organized abuse, but these reports are a good reminder that child abuse in all its forms is a huge problem. One report talked about a stepfather and other members of this religious sect, and they subjected this young boy to just horrific treatment, like throwing him in a pond at night, even trying to circumcise him with kitchen scissors, and all because he was bedwetting. It's hard to imagine that level of cruelty, in the name of religion.
It's a really disturbing example of how beliefs can be twisted, how they can lead to these unthinkable acts. And, it's not an isolated incident either. There's another report about this deputy head teacher who was convicted of indecently assaulting young girls in his class. And then there was a Pentecostal minister who raped his adopted daughter, foster father who abused two girls for 14 years. It's a grim reminder that abusers can be anywhere, in any profession, any social group.
It's almost like reading a horror novel, except this is real life. And these are just the cases that made it into the news. How many more are happening that we don't even know about? The article also mentions this couple who were involved in a child sex ring, and they even involved their own children. The husband got 23 years in prison, and the wife was jailed too. It's hard to even process that.
Yeah. It's really stark reminder that the people who are supposed to be protecting children are sometimes the ones causing the harm. And it's not always about, overt violence or organized rings either. There's a report about a mother struggling with mental illness who stabbed her 5-year-old daughter. It's a tragedy, and it highlights that complex connection between mental health and child safety.
It's just another layer to this already incredibly complicated issue. And then there's that report about the convicted pedophile who was allowed visits from children while he was in prison, and another about a child pornography ring in Melbourne, and a university employee was involved. The scoop of this problem is it's just mind-blowing. Reading all these reports, I have to admit, it's overwhelming. The sheer scale of it. Where do we even begin to address something this widespread, this insidious?
It is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's natural to feel that way. These reports, they're meant to shock us, to make us confront this reality of child abuse. But feeling overwhelmed can also be paralyzing. So I think the key is to focus on what we can control, understanding the dynamics, recognizing the signs, and supporting those who are working to protect children.
That's a really good point. It's about empowerment, not just despair. Okay, so let's go back to organized abuse specifically. The article talks about 3 possible explanations for the types of allegations we've been discussing. The first is that these horrific accounts are true, that they're happening exactly as described. The second is that they're totally made up, maybe fueled by mass hysteria or social contamination, even things like horror movies influencing kids' imaginations. And the third is that it's somewhere in between, a mix of truth and fabrication, where some events might have happened, but they've been distorted or exaggerated over time, maybe because of trauma. So how do we even start to untangle all of that?
It's one of the biggest challenges with these cases. The lack of physical evidence, for example, that often fuels the skepticism. Police investigations haven't uncovered, the bodies of babies or the blood sacrifices that people describe. But just because we haven't found evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. Trauma can really fragment memories. It can make it difficult for victims to give a clear and straightforward account.
Yeah. The article mentions a journalist who told the author about this alleged child abuse ring in Melbourne. And it involved all these professionals from different fields, claims of children being drugged, abused, smuggled out of the country. I mean, it sounds like something out of a movie. But the author's point is that we can't just dismiss these claims because they seem unbelievable.
Right. And that's where that crop circle analogy comes back in. We were so quick to accept the idea of aliens because it fit this narrative that we found, I don't know, compelling, maybe even comforting in a strange way. But the idea of organized abuse, of powerful people doing these horrible things, it forces us to look at the darkness in our own society, which is a lot harder to accept.
You've hit on something really important there. It's much easier to believe in these fantastical explanations than to accept that evil might exist, right here, right now, in our own communities, in the people and systems we trust. And this isn't just a public perception problem either. I remember that journalist Berment, who, after meeting with someone accused in the Orkney case, he actually said he wished social workers would be disbanded as a profession and dropped to the bottom of the Orkney quarry. I mean, that level of animosity towards the people who are trying to help it's really disturbing.
It is. It creates this really dangerous situation where professionals are demonized and children are silenced. If the people who are supposed to protect them are always under attack, who are they going to turn to? It just shows how important clear communication is, careful investigation, and a system that actually supports both the victims and the people trying to help them.
That's such an important point. It's about building trust, not suspicion. And the language we use plays a huge role in that. The article suggests that we should move away from terms like satanic abuse or ritual abuse because they can be misleading and they can even downplay the seriousness of the abuse for some people.
Exactly. Terms like organized abuse put the focus on what the abusers are doing, the collusion, the coordination. It takes out that sensationalism and lets us talk about the real issue. Adults using their power to harm children.
It's a shift in perspective that can make a huge difference. The author also talks about this misconception that sexual abuse is rarely violent and points out that a lot of victims actually experience both physical and emotional violence. Even just the threat of violence can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. Abuse is about power and control, and it can manifest in so many different ways. Understanding those nuances is really crucial for prevention and intervention.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We looked at the range of child abuse through those Australian news reports. We talked about the complexities of understanding and responding to allegations of organized abuse. And we touched on the psychological impact on both victims and those who are trying to protect them. So what are your main takeaways from this part of our dip dive?
For me, I think the biggest takeaway is the danger of oversimplifying things. These are really complex issues. Approaching them with preconceived notions or easy answers can have devastating consequences. So it's about staying curious, staying informed, and staying engaged in this conversation.
I couldn't agree more. So to everyone listening, what resonates with you from this exploration of child abuse? What aspects are you thinking about? We'll wrap up our deep dive after a short moment to reflect on everything we've talked about. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring child abuse and specifically allegations of organized abuse. We've looked at real cases from England and Australia, talked about the media's role, and really dug into the psychology that makes these cases so hard to understand and address.
It's been heavy, but, it's an important conversation to have. Confronting these difficult realities, it's the first step to making a safer world for kids.
One of the things that's really stood out to me is that contrast we talked about, between people being so willing to believe in those crazy explanations like aliens and crop circles, but then being so reluctant to accept the possibility of organized abuse. Why do you think that is?
I think it comes down to, people wanting to protect their worldview. Believing in aliens, yeah, it's weird, but it doesn't really change how we see humanity, But accepting that organized child abuse is real, that people we trust could be capable of such calculated cruelty, it means we have to face this darker side of human nature, and I think a lot of people would rather just avoid that.
It's easier to believe in something out there, something external, even otherworldly, than to admit that the darkness might be right here, in our communities, our systems. And we've seen how the media can make that worse. Sometimes, fanning the flames of fear and suspicion, other times just totally dismissing these allegations.
Yeah, the media has a huge responsibility here. Sensationalized reporting, it can lead to mass hysteria and false accusations. And then dismissive coverage, it silences victims and makes them afraid to come forward. Finding that balance, reporting things responsibly and accurately, that's so important.
Absolutely. And at the center of all of this are the children and adult survivors who report organized abuse. Their stories, their experiences, they have to be heard and they have to be taken seriously.
We need to create a space where survivors feel safe to talk about what happened to them without being judged or disbelieved. A space where they know they'll be listened to, believed, and supported. And that takes empathy, but it also takes understanding how trauma affects people, psychologically.
We talked about Stockholm Syndrome and defensive elaboration, those concepts that show how trauma can distort memory and make it hard for victims to give a clear, straightforward account of their experiences. So how do we navigate that? How do we balance empathy with the need for thorough investigation?
It's a tough balance. We can't just dismiss every detail that's unusual or seems fantastical and say it's just because of trauma. But we also can't assume that every single detail has to be perfectly accurate for the abuse to be real.
Hmm.
It takes careful listening, open-mindedness, and being willing to consider all the possibilities.
This deep dive has also shown how important it is to support the people who are dealing with this every day. Social workers, law enforcement, therapists, child advocates. They're under so much pressure with scrutiny from the public and the media.
They're walking a tightrope, basically, trying to protect children, but also having to deal with all these complex legal and ethical issues. Supporting their work, giving them the resources and training they need, that's essential.
In the end, protecting children from abuse, it takes everyone working together. It's not just the responsibility of certain professions or organizations. It's a societal responsibility. We all need to be aware, informed, and ready to speak up when we see something wrong.
If there's one thing I hope you take away from this deep dive, it's the importance of questioning your assumptions, challenging the narratives you hear, and being willing to face those uncomfortable truths. Child abuse, no matter what form it takes, it thrives on silence and secrecy. Shining a light on these issues, having open and honest conversations, that's how we start preventing it and helping people heal.
This deep dive into child abuse allegations, it's been tough, but it's been so important. It's made us face some really hard truths and think about these complex questions about, human nature, belief systems, and what it means to protect the most vulnerable people in our society.
And as you keep exploring this, remember to be curious, be empathetic, and really try to understand.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep working to make the world a safer place for everyone.